across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to talk about pro-life issues today, and I think you're really going to enjoy the program. As we have in studio with us today, Brian Fisher. He's been with us before, not only in studio, but by phone. But we're going to be talking about his new book, Deliver Us from Abortion, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. Brian is the president and also the co-founder of Online for Life. We're going to be talking about this book. But also, he is an individual that has spent lots of years in the media before really working in the business field as well. Was involved in a startup business firm and also as a certified financial planner, but certainly has been willing to focus on this very important issue of abortion in life. And so, Brian, last time I was talking to you, it was March for Life, and you were in a taxi cab in Washington, D.C. It's nice to be with you in studio today.
It's very nice for me to be here as well. Thank you.
I might just mention that we have lots of information about Online for Life. And I want to also encourage you to click the See More button, because it will also take you to a couple of other resources, one of which is the website, which is called deliverusfromabortion.com. We also have a number of videos for you to watch about this book and about life. So for those of you that are sort of on the front line, dealing with the issue of abortion, maybe you are working with a pregnancy resource center, maybe you are in one way or another addressing this issue, we certainly want to provide you with some resources. And Brian, I might just point out for a second, people say he's got a business background, but now he's in ministry. In some respects, you kind of reluctantly ended up in this situation for some very good reasons, and that kind of gets us into your book, doesn't it?
When I was in the business world, I really enjoyed the process of building companies and performance metrics and measurements and internet technology, and went to work for an organization in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a nonprofit that was a large media organization, and essentially did the same thing.
Yeah.
And then when I moved to Dallas in 2008 with my family, God just would not let this idea go of rescuing children from abortion using technology, internet marketing, business practices, and that really was the impetus for Online for Life and the way that it's grown today.
It's described as a transparent, metric-oriented, compassion-driven organization, and I think that's a good way to describe it, because you always keep a count on how many babies have been saved through Online for Life. What's the current count?
2,798, I believe it was, as of this morning,
Wow.
and that number clicks up, God willing, by 5, 10, sometimes 15 children a day. And that pace of rescuing children is accelerating.
Yes.
Because as business people, we now look at different ways that we can learn from what we've tried before and apply it. And so we're getting better and better and better at rescuing children as we go
It's just
forward.
a phenomenal ministry. I want you to know all about that, but also want to get into your book, because the subtitle tells it all. That is, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. You don't have to get very far in your book before you realize that if we really are honest about this, there are a fair number of individuals who go to church, maybe even hold leadership positions in the church, that nevertheless have gotten abortions or maybe counseled other people to get abortions. And while I recognize that a fair number of people that go to abortion clinics are not churchgoers, the sad reality is a lot of churchgoers are going to those abortion clinics, and it seems to me time for us to speak out on that issue.
The abortion rate inside the church is basically the same as it is outside the church. And when you think about 30 million women, and thus 30 million men, are parents of aborted children in this country, it is an enormous ministry opportunity for the Christian church. I've said every time I speak, actually, I start with the same thing. The cross of Christ is bigger than the sin of abortion. And if the church would just make that statement once a week, once a month, once a year, we would see a radical reformation regarding the abortion issue in this country. But also, we would see people, I think, by the millions, experience the grace and love of Jesus Christ for that sin. Most of the folks that we deal with that are post-abortive, had abortions in their lifetimes, suffer like no one else can understand. Guilt, shame, sadness, self-abuse. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and they need to know from the church that Jesus died for that sin and can provide that forgiveness.
Well, we need to talk about all elements of that, but I might just speak to our listeners for just a minute. Ask yourself, when's the last time you did hear a message from the pulpit or in your Sunday school class about life, about abortion, about God's grace in the midst of that? I would hope that some of you could say, well, that's not too long ago because it was during Sanctity of Life Sunday in January. I suspect there are some of you out there that are saying, I don't think I've ever heard the pastor address this issue. And for those of you that are pastors or Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders or whatever, when's the last time you've addressed that issue? And so there's 2 points. One, you just already illustrated that there are so many individuals in any typical congregation who are post-abortive. And I remember, now that's almost 30 years ago, but I remember when the Sanctity of Life Sundays were developing, I decided to address the issue of abortion just in a Sunday school class in a Bible church. And at the end, we had time for some discussion. I thought, okay, I'm going to get all sorts of tough questions. First woman stands up, and she talks about how she had abortions the first time she'd ever told anybody anywhere that she had had that. And we're all just almost weeping, and then she sits down. Someone else stands up, and I'm thinking, okay, she's going to maybe say something. No, she's had one too, and pretty soon I'm realizing that in a congregation of a Sunday school class, kind of a mini congregation, if you will, I had a handful of women that had all had abortions, and they were in a Bible church. I would think if we're really going to be honest, Brian, any pastor, any Sunday school leader, any woman's Bible teacher finds himself or herself in front of people that have been exploited by abortion. And if we don't at least address that issue with care, compassion, and grace, I think we're missing a ministry opportunity, don't you think?
I think it's a nullified gospel if we don't address it. You know, we tend to think that the gospel, as defined by Scripture, is the plan of salvation, is just the plan of salvation. And I make the case in the book that is the central aspect of the gospel, without question, that Christ came, Christ died, Christ rose again, and we have eternal salvation through him. However, the Great Commission is more than just the plan of salvation. It is the inbreaking of the kingdom of God in this world, and we serve the Lord of all creation. And so when we talk about, well, what is the Great Commission when it says, go and preach all that I have commanded you? Well, that's the entirety of Scripture. And so the role of the church is not just to tell people that Jesus has died for them. The role of the church is the propagation of the kingdom that Christ brought with him when he came to earth. And so abortion, being the greatest Holocaust in American history, bar none, is something that the church should address and is part of that same gospel message.
Yes. And again, you refer to it as a reductionist gospel in one of the chapters here. Of course, I've referred to it as a truncated gospel. It doesn't make any difference. So when we come back, let's talk about that, because we're good sometimes in the church of making converts, but I think we're supposed to make disciples. And you talk about that in the book, and then get into we're going to name some names along the way, because there are certain denominations that have never really taken a pro-life stance, and we'll give credit where credit's due when other denominations and churches have as well. But if indeed we want to understand this issue, the subtitle of the book tells it all: Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. It's a Holocaust taking place. It's something the church should address. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Brian Fisher. That coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the World Health Organization has just added an unusual disorder to its list of mental health conditions. People who play an excessive amount of video games could be diagnosed with a gaming disorder. Of course, they aren't saying that anyone who lives to play video games has this mental disorder, but they do set out some criteria to identify people with a gaming disorder. First, they show impaired control over gaming. This includes such things as frequency, intensity, and duration. Second, a person with this disorder shows an increasing priority to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. Third, there usually is a continuation or even an escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. You know, video gaming is no longer just for the young. It has become increasingly popular with people of all ages. The Entertainment Software Association estimates that more than 150 million Americans play video games. So it's not surprising that psychologists have been able to document video game addiction. It turns out that the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders defined Internet gaming disorder as a condition for further study. It also said the disorder was most common among male adolescents, but we're seeing problems surfacing in every age group. Video games can be a safe way of improving hand-eye coordination, enhancing problem-solving abilities, and relieving stress. But the concerns about addiction and gaming disorder should concern youth and adults. Video games can be addicting and apparently take over the lives of many who find them too enticing to moderate. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Brian Fisher. And by the way, we will open up the phones a bit later to give you a chance to join the conversation, maybe make some comments as we talk about the book, Deliver Us from Abortion, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. And we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net, a place where you can contact with them at Online for Life, a place for you to order this book. Please watch a few of the videos that we have posted and they have posted on their website. Then hit that share button. Put it on your Facebook page. Put it out to maybe somebody that needs to hear this message. If you have a blog, post it there. You'll start a conversation. It will be a very important one, and you may be able to save another life. So we're certainly encouraging you to do that today. Brian and I talked about creating converts and making disciples. And it seems to me that's a place where the church is sometimes better in evangelism than discipleship, but discipleship certainly would be understanding the importance and the sanctity of human life. And that's something we need to teach more about in the churches.
Proverbs 24 says, "Deliver those who are being taken away to death, and those who are staggering to slaughter, oh, hold them back."
Yeah.
I don't know if you can find a more poignant verse in Scripture that articulates the abortion holocaust in America today and the role of the church in ending that. Sometimes when I speak around the country, and I speak to a lot of church groups and conferences and services and whatnot, and I talk about the church being obligated scripturally to be involved, in fact, I believe, to be the primary catalyst to end abortion in America, there's a lot of sort of mystified looks in the audience because we've not grown up in a Christianity in America that talks about our role in the entirety of culture. We've been taught, and I was taught growing up, that my job is to evangelize and share Jesus and try to help people, get to heaven. And when we talk about the entirety of the gospel applying to the entirety of human life, that really sends some people for a bit of a loop. So when we talk about abortion and its ramifications on the church, many in the church do not view that as part of the role of the church. They say, well, that's the government's responsibility, or it's the pregnancy center's responsibility, or it's the National Right to Life's responsibility. That's not the role of the local congregation. My point is, it is precisely the role of the local congregation.
Well said. Even if you accepted that all we're supposed to do is evangelize, I think if I were to bring on Ray Comfort or Larry Moyer or a number of others, they would all point to the same thing, and that is probably more adults are coming to the Lord through pregnancy centers than almost any other evangelistic outreach, apart from maybe proclamation evangelism or something like that, because it is so effective. Because not only are you saving babies, you're really saving souls. And I can't think of a pregnancy resource center banquet I've been to in years where there hasn't been at least testimonies not only of saved babies, but testimonies of people that have come to know the Lord in the midst of all that.
If we acknowledge that the crisis pregnancy or the Abortion Act itself are two very critical crisis moments, and we are very vulnerable in those moments, and there isn't a better time to acknowledge our need for a Savior. Christ, at least in my life, when I came to a recognition of my sin and just how damning that was, is when I realized the need for a Savior, and God in His mercy and in His will uses these very dark moments to draw us to Him. And so the crisis pregnancy situation is frankly a perfect opportunity to introduce somebody to Jesus Christ, because they recognize at that moment, I need help, and I need eternal help. I need the help of the Lord.
Let's see if we can get into one of the premises of the book. Chapter 3 talks about child sacrifice in the church, and that's pretty strong, but I turn a few pages here, and you have the religious affiliation of women obtaining abortions. The highest percentage, 37% Protestant. Second highest percentage, 28% Catholic. Then you get to no religious affiliation, 27%, and you have another 8% where you have no response. The numbers tell me that more than 2/3 of the individuals who are going into abortion clinics, women going into the abortion clinics, are either Protestant or Catholic. They're not atheist. They're not non-church attenders. It seems to me that if the church were to address this issue and the church were to act like the church, abortion would be as rare as Bill Clinton one day said that it was going to be. What about that?
When folks that go to church once a month, once a week, never hear from the pulpit or from the Sunday school or from a respected leader about the sacredness of human life, and instead hear that if you get pregnant out of wedlock, you are now going to be shamed, then they have no context in which to make a decision for life. And so, although those statistics are shocking, in light of the fact that precious few congregations are talking about abortion on a regular basis, it really isn't that surprising, because people are making decisions based on what they hear in the culture or from the mainstream media, who for 43 years have been expertly, brilliantly articulating why abortion is a woman's right and is something that is healthy for society. There's no counterbalance.
Yes. Well, it does seem to me that we need to change that monologue and that filibuster taking place. But it is, I think, striking to recognize that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. So in the midst of that sort of pro-abortion, secular, humanistic filibuster, still the youngest generation tends to be the most pro-life of any generation.
That's fascinating, because I was born in 1972, so I don't have any context of life without abortion being legal, but the
Yes.
boomers, of course, do, and the boomers as a generation fought for that right?
Yeah.
Not all of them, but that's the generation that brought abortion into the mainstay. The millennials have an interesting perspective. They don't really want to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
So they have a very pacifist approach, and so intuitively they understand that abortion is the killing of a human life. That's scientific fact. It's not opinion. And so they inherently just don't like it because it's sort of violent. Now, ironically, it is the millennials who are the generation that are currently aborting their children. So there's this dichotomy of where publicly they tend to be more pro-life, but privately, when they get into a situation themselves, there's still a decision that has to be made, and so there's still work that has to be done from the church.
You know, Sean McDowell and especially John Stonestreet have written on some of these things. I think John Stonestreet had a great little line. He said, the typical millennial will say, I think abortion is wrong. And so they're more likely than any generation to say, I think abortion is wrong, I think it's morally wrong, and I would not do it. But they're also more likely than many generations to drive their friend to an abortion clinic. So they live in that dichotomy of, on the one hand, they believe it, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily play out in terms of practice. Let's talk about those religious groups for just a minute, and I know there are going to be all sorts of people who are going to want to ask some make some comments and ask some questions. When I break it down in your book, the religious segments who don't think abortion is a moral issue, the highest percentage are white mainline Protestants. So maybe after the break we can talk about some of those, but the National Council of Churches type. But then the next group that see a religious segment who does not believe that abortion is a moral issue are white Catholics, which is interesting because you would think that the Catholic Church, from the Pope all the way down, has really spoken to that issue. And then you work your way to others, but it is kind of striking that further down, white Protestants, black evangelical Protestants, that's a lower percentage. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush, and anybody reads the book will see very quickly that what is taught from the pulpit and what is actually part of the doctrinal statement or of the catechism of that particular denomination also seems to have a really profound impact on whether or not that individual is going to go and look for an abortion if he or she, if she's pregnant and if he or she is feeling that abortion is the only answer.
There is a disconnect still between what a church espouses as its core beliefs and what is actually taught and practiced in the church.
Yeah.
I have numerous friends who are pro-life Catholics who bemoan that. You can't picture a better example of pro-life doctrine than John Paul's Evangelism Vitae, which is an elegant pro-life document that guides the Catholics' thinking on the pro-life issue. And yet, when you get to the parish level, oftentimes that doctrine isn't taught, or if it's taught, it's ignored.
Yeah.
And the Catholic pro-life contingency really is still struggling to understand how do we translate what is proper doctrine into the actual lives of folks who are attending our churches and parishes. And my discussions with them have indicated they still feel like they have a long way to go. In the Protestant church, which of course is a decentralized church, unlike the Catholic church, it's who knows? Like, you go to a certain congregation of a certain denomination, you may or may not hear about pro-life. There's no regularity with how you're going to be taught and when you're going to be taught those doctrines.
Well, let's take a break. And when we come back, I want to spend a little bit of time first talking about what is available through Online for Life, because not only do they have an online presence, but they also have pregnancy centers, and I think they can be a great resource to those of you who I say always are on the front lines of the pro-life debate and discussion. Those are pro-life pastors. Those are individuals that work at pregnancy centers and all sorts of other locations. So we certainly want you to know about some of the resources. But let me also open up the phones, because we are talking today about abortion and the pro-life message. And I'd love to know your testimony, love to know what's happening in your church, your denomination. And we're talking about awakening the church to end the killing of America's children. The book is entitled Deliver Us from Abortion. We have information about it on our website, pointofview.net, and we'll take your phone calls at 1-800-351-1212.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today, and we have in studio with us Brian Fisher as we talk about his book, Deliver Us from Abortion. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've got a number of phone calls. We'll get to those in just a minute. But, Brian, I would love to have you for just a moment talk about Online for Life, because there's some great resources. And you're a fellow traveler with people that have pregnancy resource centers, because I know you have one here and one in Pittsburgh. Is that right?
That's right.
And so talk about how people can use the resources you've been making available to everybody.
Well, if you are a fan of prayer, and I hope you are, one of the best resources that we provide is a free smartphone app that you can go to prolifeapp.com, prolifeapp.com, download the app, plug in your email address, and then you can actually intercede for a woman who is at risk to abort right now. The technology that we employ is really phenomenal, and every time that we get a phone call or an appointment set for a woman at a pro-life pregnancy center who is considering abortion, a prayer request goes out to the app. And so we have every day thousands of prayers registered for women who are at risk to abort. We believe that abortion is primarily a spiritual issue and must be fought with spiritual tools, and prayer is obviously our primary tool apart from the word. And so that's a great resource. If you haven't already joined us on Facebook, facebook.com/online for life, there's a community of 630,000 people around the world, 45 countries, the most active pro-life social community in the world. Join us there, because every time that we have a new initiative, a new opportunity, we're going to announce it there, and that's a great way to get started. So those two are probably the best ways to get linked in.
And again, we have links to Online for Life as well as deliverusfromabortion.com and so many others. But let's take some phone calls along the way, get some of your comments. We'll head out to Texas first. Brandy, thank you for calling today. You're on with Brian Fisher.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited. I just got in the tail end of this conversation on my way to work, but thank you so much for writing this book and being so vocal about it. I've been praying about men, for men, to rise up and address this situation, because I feel like there's a lot of women that have been out there and speaking against abortion because they've been redeemed. The Lord has healed their hearts, and I'm one of those. And so since then, I've seen the need for men to rise up, and I don't even know if you're post-abortive or not, but I just thank you being a man rising up and saying, okay, we've got to get into the churches, and men of God have got to rise up and address this situation. And so I just want to thank you.
Brandy, I appreciate your call, and thanks for the kind words. We believe that abortion exists in America primarily because of men. Not because of women. I don't want to plug another book, but the previous book was called Abortion, the Ultimate Exploitation of Women. You can get it Online for Life.
Very good book, too.
And it chronicles that very fact, that men are the ones that have been driving the legalization and propagation of abortion. And so I feel that women have been shouldering the burden of the pro-life movement for most of the last 40 years. Not entirely, but primarily. And yet, if you look at the last 3 or 4 years, Brandy, you're going to see that God is raising up more and more men to join women in this effort. And I think cooperatively, we're going to get this done in our lifetimes. We're going to see it ended so that others don't suffer the way that you have suffered, and we can get this thing wiped off the map here in America.
Brandy, what have you found in the churches? Any comments about that?
Yes, I have. The Lord healed my heart 12 years ago, and I've been speaking in all sorts of denominational churches. I've spoken in the Baptist church. I've spoken the Methodist, Catholic, non-denominational. And what I find is in the non-denominational churches and interdenominational churches, they're more open for recovery programs after an abortion. Now, I go to a Southern Baptist church, and my pastor talks against abortion, but also offers, opportunity for healing from an abortion. And he's very wonderful and very supportive in my local ministry. But I find that in the Baptist churches, it's not as desired for healing. It's like there's such a stronghold to be genuine and real that's just too dark of a secret to even go there. And the sad thing about it is when I share my testimony or people, they get to know me, when I share that I do have abortion recovery Bible studies, I can tell by the way people respond to me whether they or not they've had an abortion.
Yes.
And so I know that one part of that is revealed to me just so I can pray for them. But it breaks my heart that I'm discerning and I can tell, and yet they're so locked into this, holding on to this dark secret that they won't reach out and get healing.
Let me come to you for just a minute, Brian, because in your book you talk about some of the things you hear from pastors. We don't want to offend anyone. To teach about abortion is self-indicting, which is true. Abortion is not a core issue for us. And of course, we've already talked about the other one, the focus on the reductionist gospel. I mean, you have a whole chapter really addressing some of the kinds of comments you hear from pastors who are somewhat like Pastors Brandy's talking about. They go, we just don't talk about that in our church.
In fairness to pastors, it's extraordinarily difficult, and they have a lot of balls in the air, and they have a lot of things that they have to take care of, and they're trying to appeal to a broad range of folks in their congregation. So I get that. My point to pastors, however, is you must recognize that in your congregation, regardless of what state you're in, you have people who are like Brandy, who for years were suffering shame and guilt and remorse for an abortion, and they are not hearing from you that sin is covered by the cross. Where else are they going to hear that? And so I'm not suggesting that every church needs to get involved politically, that every church needs to get involved and picket Planned Parenthood. There are churches that do that, and that's good. But every church should have some sort of initiative that deals with this abortion epidemic. 1/6 of the United States population is missing because of abortion. We cannot just brush that under the rug and say, well, this isn't an issue that affects my congregation. It does. You're missing 1/6 of your congregation.
Yeah, very well said. Let's take another phone call. We'll go up to the state of Wyoming this time. KCMI. Jan, thank you for calling today.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm sorry. I'm just stopping my car. I, like Brandy, caught the tail end of what you were talking about. And I wanted to share with you that there's another place in the Bible that got my attention, why I should be involved, and that was Leviticus 20. And they were talking about when they were sacrificing their babies to Moloch. Mm-hmm. And God told them that if they knew that it was happening in their community and they did nothing, first of all, his face would be turned against the people that were doing that. And then his face would be turned against the ones that didn't do anything to try to stop them. So I just thought I would.
That's a fabulous point. It's interesting in the Old Testament and the prophets. There's 3 times where God, through, I think it's Jeremiah, uses this phrase in relation to child sacrifice. And the Old Testament often uses the phrase "passing through fire," the children passing through fire offered to Moloch through child sacrifice. And God uses the terminology, "It did not even enter my mind that you would do this." And child sacrifice is sort of the last straw before judgment comes. And so Jan's exactly right. We not only need to be offering the grace and forgiveness of Jesus Christ, we need to be asking for forgiveness for allowing 57 million children to be sacrificed in the name of convenience or financial security or all the other really lame excuses that we use to justify abortion, and prostrate ourselves before Almighty God and say, look, we will bind ourselves together and end this for your glory and for our nation's benefit.
Thank you, Jan. Since you mentioned a verse, just for a minute, I recognize and probably can even imagine that most of our listeners have probably heard of some verses that would be appropriate. But if you are in a church where you've never heard a pastor preach on it, let's work our way through that. Psalm 139, where David reflects upon God's care and compassion extends to him. You mentioned Jeremiah and Isaiah, the fact that before they were born, God already called them out to a ministry. You can think of John the Baptist leaping in the womb. You can think of in Psalm 51:5 that, from the moment of conception, David has a sin nature. There are quite a number of verses that you talk about in this book, and certainly people can find on your website, to help them understand biblically how they should think about this issue of abortion.
Well, and one of the passages which spoke to me that I for some reason I never really thought through was the incarnation. We think Jesus came to earth as a baby. Jesus came to earth as a zygote. God came to earth in human form through the same process that we come to. I mean, it's just if you sit and dwell on that for a while, it's really mind-blowing. And I'm not sure if there's a stronger case for the sacredness of human life from conception, because God himself came to earth through that same process. What a startling thought to really mull over.
Just lots of wisdom in this book, Deliver Us from Abortion, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. When we come back, we'll maybe take another phone call if we have time, but most importantly, I want to talk about some action steps. There are some very good action steps here, what you can do in your church, what you can do in your nonprofit organization, what you can do at your crisis pregnancy center, pregnancy resource center. So we want to give you some action items. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Brian Fisher with us for a few more minutes, and he is the co-founder of Online for Life, which is an organization I really want to encourage you to find out more about. Of course, this is a book called Deliver Us from Abortion, and if you go to our website, as I've mentioned before, we've got all sorts of great resources there. You can click on his picture there. It will take you to deliverusfromabortion.com. Great resource there. You can click on the book. We've made it very easy for you to order it. You can click on the actual video that we have there. And then we also posted just kind of a short little review of this that came from the publisher. So you have lots of information that is available. But for just a minute, since we were going through some of those verses, help us out, if you might, Brian. How do we articulate this view to our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, maybe even our fellow church members? one thing is they can go to Online for Life, and you're actually posting some blog posts so people can see how you make the case for life. It's not that difficult because there's really not any arguments on the other side other than emotionalism or finger-pointing, name-calling, that kind of thing. Would you say? Isn't that fair?
It's very fair. I have conversations all the time, mainly in email and social media with abortion advocates, and I've yet ever to have a conversation which focuses on facts, ever. I argue in a way that is compassionate and winsome because I understand that most folks that are arguing for abortion rights don't know Christ, and so I try to take a graceful approach, and yet, inevitably, every time, the conversation ends with me being called names or outlandish statements because the abortion argument has zero truth, none. And even if you don't hold to the tenets of Scripture, the abortion argument holds no truth. Mm-hmm. Because the only way that an abortion advocate can promote their worldview is if they concede that there is a class of human being which we are willing to discriminate against to the point of killing them, which is a very unpopular position to take. When we talk about value and devaluing life in the womb, we're not just devaluing life in the womb, we are negating life in the womb and treating that life as if it's a tumor or a tonsil. And so the abortion advocate must resort to other means in order to try to make their case. However, the good news is that there's certain scriptural evidence, and the book covers that. There's a wonderful book called The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. I think it is the ultimate work on how to argue the pro-life cause from a philosophical, ethical standpoint. And R.C. Sproul has a wonderful book called Abortion, which just celebrated its 20th year, and I think from a philosophical standpoint is a seminal work. If someone were to just take the time and read those three books, Deliver Us from Abortion, R.C. Sproul's Abortion, and Scott Klusendorf's The Case for Life, you will be armed to be able to tackle this in any venue.
You know, I might even mention another one, Randy Alcorn,
Yes.
Pro-life answers to pro-choice or pro-abortion arguments. And so, there are lots of those resources, but part of the problem is that we have, as you talk about in the book, the churches sometimes that shrug their shoulders. And I recognize that maybe this will encourage them to take a stand. But you also have a chapter here about confused churches. And it seems to me that I still, because there is this sort of filibuster, this secular pro-abortion filibuster out there, and maybe people haven't done enough thinking about that, we really need to arm people in the congregation, and pastors need to be on the forefront of that, of arming them to be able to give a quick, cogent, graceful answer and gracious answer to individuals that might think that the only solution to their so-called problem pregnancy is abortion.
We have a great division at Online for Life that does just that. They are specifically tasked with serving the local church. So if you go to onlineforlife.org and you just email us, we will get one of those individuals in touch with you. That is what they do. They do apologetic sessions, they do training sessions, they'll do conversations, they do media appearances, myself included, because this is not really a difficult issue to articulate. And I often relate it to this way. If the church was aware that in their local community, 35 kindergartners were being killed on playgrounds in their city every day,
sure, yeah,
would the church become involved?
Oh, sure.
And if it happened 100 times around the 3,500 kindergartners being massacred every day, would the church, regardless of denomination or sect, get involved? And the answer is 99.9% of them would do that.
Yeah.
So why are we not doing that? And the answer is because the church, on the whole, is devaluing life in the womb.
No, it certainly is.
But that's not philosophically, ethically, or scripturally true.
Let's give people some action items. First of all, one of the things you suggested is to sign up and get that app. But another one is this book. I know you have some people that would like to put this book in the hand of every pastor in the country.
That's right.
And whether she can do it or not, I know there's some others who would like to do this. I know there are probably people out there who would like to get this book and put it in the hands of every member of Congress. But how can they get some of these resources, and what would be the possibility of them saying, I know pastors in my community. I want to give a copy of this to every pastor in my community, every pastor in my diocese, every pastor in my parish. Is that possible?
It is. We have a woman right now in Illinois who is on a one-woman campaign to get the book in the hands of every pastor in her state and in Iowa and Indiana, and she's making it happen. And we do volume discounts. We're building websites for her. We're building support mechanisms so that she can execute that campaign. The best way to get a hold of us, savebabies@onlineforlife.org. Just email us, savebabies@onlineforlife.org. Get in touch with our team, and we will work with you if you're heart and your calling is to get these types of resources in the hands of leaders and church leaders, and we are supporting several people now across the country who are doing just that.
You know, one of the things we're doing right now is this Pray for America campaign. So I want to encourage our listeners, especially if they've signed up for the Pray for America campaign or just finding out about it, to also get that app. So talk about that again. How wouldn't it be amazing if we could get lots of the listeners to Point of View to join together nationally, because we're in 42 different states where we are heard right now, and encourage them to pray for a woman considering abortion. And she's an abortion-minded woman who's convinced the only solution to her so-called problem pregnancy is abortion, and to pray the resources that we can down upon her and have her to choose life. So talk again about how people can actually connect up with you through that app.
It's a free smartphone app. It works on Android and Apple devices. You can get it at prolifeapp.com, prolifeapp.com. And again, it's free. And it basically connects into our technology. When a woman in any of the states that we work with 30 pro-life pregnancy centers in 15 states. When a woman contacts us who is at risk to abort, a prayer request goes out through that app, and you basically pray and can swipe the app that you've prayed. It tracks your prayers and will tell you how many babies you've helped to save. It actually tracks that. You can form prayer teams, your small group, your Sunday school class, your family, where you have multiple people. You can chat with them. You can challenge them. You can say, we want to pray 300 times this week. We want to pray 3,000 times this month. It will track that. It is a phenomenal free resource, and you can today help us rescue more and more children from abortion using this free app.
Brian Fisher, always great to have you in studio. Again, I would encourage people to connect up with Online for Life. Get copies of the book, Deliver Us from Abortion, Awakening the Church to End the Killing of America's Children. It's always great to have you in studio. Let's do it again sometime.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
It's a lot better than being in the
taxi.
back end of a taxi in that cold weather in the March for Life. So let's get you in a nice warm studio again, and we'll do that. Okay, let's take a break. And again, you can visit our website, pointofview.net. Let's also, while you go to the website, talk a little bit about some of the resources that are there. We talk about this from time to time, but it would be good to once again focus on all sorts of things that we want to try to provide to you so that we can educate you, so that we can equip you and empower you to make a difference. The first is my Viewpoints commentary, and we make that available to you. And if you aren't already receiving it in your inbox, you can go and sign up for it. You're going to find that very helpful as you look at various issues and have the documentation for some of the things we talk about. So first of all, go to the Viewpoints section and find some of that material. Certainly take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. As you do so, don't forget that we, of course, are dependent upon your financial gifts to keep this program growing, and so anything that you can do to help us out financially would be greatly appreciated. Any gift of any size is helpful, and I might also challenge some of you that have not supported this program to maybe just even consider sending a one-time gift. This is a way in which you can help us to be more effective, and so we certainly would encourage you to go to the website pointofview.net, and I might encourage you to bookmark it as well. Take the time to visit the website pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about anger, and that is something that is so misunderstood. Oftentimes people think, well, you're never to get angry. Well, does God get angry? Well, I think so. Did Jesus ever get angry? Yes. Okay, so there may be a positive basis to anger, but we also see how devastating anger can be in a family relationship and in a marriage. So we're going to talk about what's God's purpose for anger and how maybe we can process the anger we might have in a positive way, how to deal with individuals that maybe are angry with you, how to address the issue of anger in your children, in your spouse. There's a lot that we're going to cover, and it comes from an individual that we have talked with so many times here on the program, Dr. Gary Chapman, probably best known, of course, for his 5 love languages and his 5 love language series, as well as his radio program and all the various aspects of that. Of course, he's a speaker, a writer, and a counselor, and director of marriage and family consultants, and he is going to really, in a sense, help us deal with this issue of anger. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to be with you again.
Always good to have you on the program, and love your basic common sense biblical perspective on this. And anger is, I guess, one of those topics people might not have think you would write about because you're so known for love languages. But as a counselor, you well recognize that one of the biggest issues to address when you're dealing with marriage and family issues is this issue of anger, isn't it?
Well, you're exactly right, Kerby. I think many, many marriages have been destroyed by mismanaged anger, and many children have been greatly hurt by mismanaged anger on the part of their parents. So this whole issue of understanding anger, where it comes from, what's the purpose, how do we channel it in a positive direction, the whole thing is just extremely important in having healthy family relationships.
I just mentioned that we have information about your book, which is just out, published by Moody Press, so look for it in your local bookstore. Of course, there's a way you can order as well. But also we have a video about 2 minutes long, which I encourage people to watch, and then maybe click on the share button. They can put it on their Facebook page and start a conversation, pass it on to some others that need to hear about that. And your argument in the video, and it shows up a little bit later in your book, is that there are really 2 kinds of anger, because there is the anger that is justifiable from a biblical point of view, and then there is the anger which is an overreaction oftentimes to the fact that we have in one way or another had somebody abuse us or take advantage of us, or it's in some way are distorted. So we need to recognize that we're not starting out with the assumption that all anger is bad. We just recognize that most of it ends up being that way, right?
Yeah, I think Kerby, ultimately, anger, I believe, is a gift of God. And I think it grows out of the reality that we have a concern for right. As you mentioned earlier, God, the Bible says God is angry every day with the wicked. And I think the reason God feels angry is because the wicked violate his principles that he's laid out for us. And when they do, they hurt themselves, they hurt everybody around them, they ultimately hurt the kingdom of God, and God feels anger. And I think we feel anger for the same reason. We have this sense of right. Even if we're not a Christian, we have a sense of right. And when our sense of right is violated, we feel angry. And so that kind of anger is wholesome, is good, is a gift of God. But just as Satan has twisted and distorted every gift of God, he's also twisted and distorted anger. And so not all of our anger grows out of a violation of what is right. often it's simply we didn't get our way. You can see it in a 4-year-old.
Sure.
Asked for a candy bar and didn't get it, and they get angry. Well, that's not legitimate anger. It's that they didn't get what they wanted. So we have both kinds of anger as an adult as well.
But even at a young age, kids sometimes have a sense of justice, too. That's not right. You promised. That's not fair. And you talk about that. But you have a section here on when anger can be good. And I thought that was good just to mention for a minute, because we're going to talk about the negative aspects. But certainly what made Jesus angry, you deal with that. You talk about a mother's responsible to a terrible wrong, and that's mothers against drunk driving. You give another example, of course, of William Wilberforce standing up against slavery. And, of course, we could add to that Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement and on and on and on. That chapter is a reminder that anger channeled in the right way sometimes leads to positive social action. And that's something that we should not hide or dismiss or diminish, because those are very important actions that have led to greater justice in our world.
I really think that's true, Kerby, that in that sense, many of the great reformations in culture have come because people felt angry. People said, this is not right, and they took action to right the wrongs. And as you mentioned, Wilberforce and others, it took years and years for that to really happen, but at least they were moving in the right direction. All great social reform really is born out of anger. But as you know, Kerby, and I know, even anger at social issues can be handled in a positive way or can be handled in a negative way.
Well, let's talk about that, because you have a chapter on when you're angry for good reason. You can even be angry and be good and angry, as some people like to say, but then you can respond inappropriately and thus miss the opportunity of that gift that God has actually given to you. So let's talk about that for a minute. We're going to be focusing most of our time and attention for the rest of the hour on the negative aspects of anger. But for just a minute, if somebody is upset about social injustice, maybe they weren't paid what they felt that they deserved, somebody violated them in some way, and so they have a right to be angry. They actually are following, if you will, a biblical principle in their anger, but how do they prevent from using the wrong means to address it in a positive way?
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen. When people are burning buildings, for example, and setting cars on fire, that's not, the anger might be legitimate over what happened, but it's not helping the situation. It's making things worse. And now other people get angry at them for what they've done because what they did was wrong. So, that's why I think the Bible says, being angry, sin not. Whether it's a social issue or whether it's a personal thing that's been done to you, we may well have legitimate anger, but don't sin in that anger. Take steps that will be positive. And the biblical pattern is, on a personal level, if someone has wronged you and consequently you feel angry with them about it, if they don't come to you immediately and apologize, you go to them, Jesus said, and you confront them. And if they repent, you forgive them, and the whole thing's resolved. So always God's purpose is that the legitimate anger, what I call definitive anger, is for the purpose of motivating us to take positive steps to make things better. And often, of course, we take steps that make things worse.
And again, I think the value there is sometimes to take some time, first to acknowledge that you are angry, but restrain yourself from taking an initial reaction. Proverbs 29 says, fools vent their anger, but the wise quietly hold back. Really begin to think through what's the appropriate response and maybe take a more constructive action item. So indeed, you may have been harmed. Your anger may be positive, but you can blow the opportunity, if you will, by sometimes taking the wrong action in the midst of that anger. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and spend some time getting into that in a little more detail, but then also looking at the negative aspects of anger. And that is, of course, what is tearing marriages and families apart, certainly destroying the cohesion even of football teams and businesses and all the rest. So we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman about anger. We'll do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the World Health Organization has just added an unusual disorder to its list of mental health conditions. People who play an excessive amount of video games could be diagnosed with a gaming disorder. Of course, they aren't saying that anyone who lives to play video games has this mental disorder, but they do set out some criteria to identify people with a gaming disorder. First, they show impaired control over gaming. This includes such things as frequency, intensity, and duration. Second, a person with this disorder shows an increasing priority to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. Third, there usually is a continuation or even an escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. You know, video gaming is no longer just for the young. It has become increasingly popular with people of all ages. The Entertainment Software Association estimates that more than 150 million Americans play video games. So it's not surprising that psychologists have been able to document video game addiction. It turns out that the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders defined Internet gaming disorder as a condition for further study. It also said the disorder was most common among male adolescents, but we're seeing problems surfacing in every age group. Video games can be a safe way of improving hand-eye coordination, enhancing problem-solving abilities, and relieving stress. But the concerns about addiction and gaming disorder should concern youth and adults. Video games can be addicting and apparently take over the lives of many who find them too enticing to moderate. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, life is full of frustrations, and sometimes it's easy to get angry, even blow a gasket, but that's why we're talking about the subject of anger today. The book is entitled Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion, and it is written by Dr. Gary Chapman, and it is published by Moody Publishers. And Gary, we were talking about the positive aspects of anger, but even there, we have to be very careful that our response, even when we may be justified in being angry, is one that is God-honoring.
Yeah, and I think that's always the objective. You know, if we follow God's plan, what does God do when God gets angry? Okay, typically, he sends a spokesman to the people at whom he's angry and says, you've broken God's law, and God is angry with you, and if you don't turn around, God's going to bring punishment. And God's desire is they will turn around. You know, Nineveh is a good example of this. He sent Jonah. And if they turn around and repent, God forgives them. So that's a good example for us. We should always reach out to the person at whom we're angry and extend a hand, hoping that they're going to repent and confess and apologize, and we can forgive them, and the relationship will be restored.
You know, the Bible has a lot to say about anger. Proverbs 14:17, a short-tempered man or short-tempered person do foolish things, and Proverbs 19:11, sensible people control their temper. We have a lot of those examples in the Proverbs, but in your chapter on when anger is wrong, you even tell us the story about Naaman in 2 Kings, and Naaman was an angry person, wasn't he?
Yeah, it's another example of someone who got angry, not because a wrong was committed, but because it wasn't done their way. You know, he was a leper, and he was advised to go to Israel, to the prophet of God, and that he would pray to God and his leprosy be forgiven. So he went over to see Elijah, and he sent out servant and said to him, "Hey, just go dip 7 times in the Jordan River and you'll be clean." And he got super angry. He said, "I have rivers in my country. Why are you sending me to the dirty Jordan River?" He went away angry because the prophet didn't do it his way. In fact, he actually said, "I thought he would come out, hold his hand over my prophecy, pray to his God, and heal me." Since he didn't do it his way, he was angry. And finally, somebody prevailed and said, "Look, why don't you try what the prophet said? Go dip in Jordan and see what happens." He did, and he was healed. So many biblical examples of that. Cain got angry with God because God didn't accept his sacrifice, and he accepted his brother's sacrifice. But the real issue was he didn't offer the sacrifice God required, and God had already told him that. So, there are biblical examples and many examples in our own lives when we get angry because we simply did not get our way.
Well, and another aspect of that, you can see it with Naaman, you can see it with David, you can see it with the Egyptian Pharaoh and others. If you're in a position of privilege, as a leader or a king would be, they're used to getting their own way. Now, let me extrapolate that. Okay, none of us are kings, but most of us live in a world where we do pretty much get our own way. We live in a world of convenience here in the 21st century. So we're used to basically having everything the way we want it. And when we go in and order coffee, we know exactly how it's supposed to be. And when we put something in the microwave, we expect it to take only a certain amount of time. That's one of the reasons why you find individuals in the 21st century getting angry over what I call first world problems that you would never even think about if you lived in the third world. And so in some respects, this issue of anger is not diminishing in our world because more and more of us live in a life of privilege and convenience. More and more of us are going to probably run into anger and maybe even exhibit it ourselves.
I think that's true, Kerby, and especially in marriage. Before we're married, we do things the way we want it done. We get married, we anticipate our spouse will do things the way we want them done. Yes. Simple things like loading a dishwasher. I remember in my own life, I got super angry with my wife by the way she loaded a dishwasher. I'm a very organized person. I believe the dishwasher should be organized in a certain way. My wife would load the dishwasher like she was playing Frisbee, And I gave her lectures about, God is a God of order, and I finally realized, and we finally settled the whole issue, and she said, "Honey, I'd be really happy for you to load the dishwasher, and you can do it your way."
Yes. Well, that brings us to one of the principles you talk about, that is negotiating and understanding, to sometimes say, this really bothers me. And so whether it's the cap on the toothpaste tube or whether it's the way in which you load the dishwasher or how you use the remote control on the television or where you park your car in the garage, whatever, sometimes there just needs some open conversation in what you call a non-judgmental atmosphere.
Yeah, and you have to acknowledge, first of all, that anger is not legitimate anger. I was mad at my wife simply because she wasn't doing it the way I wanted it. She didn't sin. It was no sin the way she was doing it, So you have to recognize that first and acknowledge to God, forgive me for being so self-centered that I have to have everything my way. It's a sign of immaturity. But then you can still go back and negotiate. You can go back and talk about it. Honey, I really did feel angry when this happened, and I know that it's not sinful, but it does irritate me. Is there any way we could negotiate? What could we do here? Is there a possibility you could change? Or maybe I just need to change my perspective. So it's okay to go back, especially in a close relationship like marriage, to go back and try to negotiate something that will work better for you in the future, and it will not continue to be, an irritation for you.
And I think there's another principle that we need to understand, and that is to have that open communication and not let it build up. And I think all of us at one time or another are guilty of that, where we finally explode, and it's been building for some time. But let's take a typical scenario that you talk about with Rita and Doug. That is, they both work, they come home, but, he's always heading off with the boys, or he's watching a football game, and she needs help with the chores. There needs to be some communication about the fact that I am getting more and more angry, and sooner or later I'm going to be shouting about this because I expect you to do something in the household other than come and plop in front of the television set on the couch watching a football game.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we allow anger to build up inside is because some Christians have the idea that it's sinful to be angry. good Christians don't get angry. And so when they feel anger, they say to themselves, okay, I shouldn't be angry. And they just hold it inside. They don't talk about it. They don't try to negotiate. And if you hold it inside long enough, what you described earlier is what's going to happen. We're going to have a big explosion over something that may be trivial because we've allowed all that pressure to build up inside. So always the biblical pattern is you move out as quickly as possible and try to reconcile. In fact, the same passage that says in Ephesians 4, being angry, sin not, also says, don't let the sun go down on your anger.
Right.
That is, we're supposed to get rid of anger, rather quickly. Anger was designed to be a visitor, not a resident.
Well said. And you're really talking at this point about what you call explosions and implosions. And you said sometimes people say, well, what is that? Well, implosions usually have some characteristics. You call them denial, withdrawal, and brooding. With denial, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. Or I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. I'm not angry, I just don't like it when people do that. Well, sometimes the first step is to get off of the denial and out of the withdrawal part, but be willing to eventually have some meaningful communication in the midst of that implosion, right?
Yeah, the starting place is to admit that you're angry. And then the second place you've already alluded to, I think, is that we restrain our immediate response, because our immediate response is probably going to be detrimental. So you restrain that. When I was growing up, Kerby, my mother told me, son, when you get angry, always count to 10 before you do anything. Well, I think Mother was on the right track, but I would suggest you count to 100 or 1,000. 10 is not long enough.
10 is not long enough.
It's just a method of calming down and giving yourself time to think about it. One lady told me, she said, you know what I decided? That when I was angry, I was going to run and water my flowers. She said the first summer I did that, I almost drowned my petunias.
That's a great line. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, let's take another aspect of that, and that is the passive-aggressive behavior. And I'm sure there's some people listening right now that are shaking their heads. And then what to do when you're angry at your spouse, how to help your children handle their angry. And I appreciate you putting this in there, a chapter on, well, what if I'm angry at God? What about all that? Or I'm angry at myself. And most importantly, if I'm dealing with an angry person, how do I confront him or her? So just a lot of great practical information, as you would expect, from a book by Dr. Gary Chapman. The book is entitled Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion, and it's available in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link so that you can find it there as well. And if you're an angry person or know an angry person, you certainly will want to have a copy of this book. There's even a personal anger assessment designed to help you see how you manage anger. So lots of great practical material in the book. But if you'd like to join us, we'll take some calls from those of you that would like to address this issue of anger. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. How can we, from a biblical point of view, handle anger in a way that honors God? We'll continue that conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman and you right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Gary Chapman as we talk about his book, Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take one of those phone calls. We'll go to South Carolina, WAGP. And Jerry, thank you for calling today. What's your question?
I am so in shock that I'm speaking to Dr. Chapman. You have been one of my Christian icons for decades.
Well, thank you, Jerry.
That said, 21 years ago, I had a 5-year-old who was punching holes in his room with a pencil. And I had tried, there were up to about 50 holes, and I had tried spanking, lecturing, you name it. I get home, and I don't know why wives always seem to do this, but as soon as I walked in the door, my wife hit me up with there's 50 new holes in the wall. I went and I looked, and sure enough, there were about 50 holes in the wall. I went back, and this time I did something different. I went back, and I prayed, and I talked to God, and I spent 5 to 10 minutes praying and, admitting my sin, that I was angry, but this was not the right solution. It's in your hands, God, because I can't do this. And I walked over to speak to my 5-year-old, and he was scared because I spank hard. And he knew that was coming, and I didn't know what was going to pop out of my mouth. And I said, Tony, you are going to kiss and apologize to each and every hole in the wall. And we went to his room, and he wouldn't do it, so I shoved his head to the first hole, and he kissed it and told him he was sorry and he would never do it again. And we went through all 100 holes in the wall, and it never happened again. It's amazing what happens when God is in control.
That's quite a story.
That's a good story, yes.
Well, Jerry, thank you for calling. Thank you for starting us off. And, there are solutions to this. And, of course, we'll jump ahead in just a few minutes probably to that whole section on dealing with anger that your children might have. But I did promise that we, just before we take another phone call, talk about this idea of a passive-aggressive behavior, because that is sometimes more difficult to deal with, because an individual say, I'm not angry, but then they do everything they can to mess your life up. And it seems to me that that's another aspect of implosive, if you will, anger, something that you address in the book.
It is, and often this happens in children, especially teenagers. If you have a very strong parent who says to a teenager or a 10-year-old, shut up, you're not going to talk to me that way. You go to your room until you can come out and show me some respect. Okay, they go to their room, but now that anger that they had towards you goes underground. And if you have a few of those kind of experiences where they're not allowed to process their anger with you, that anger goes inside, and it will show up in their behavior. So externally, they're passive, but internally, they're boiling. And eventually, it'll come out in aggression. And it comes out in all kinds of ways. With teenagers, they may become sexually active. They may try drugs. They may do all kinds of things. And it's not that they're consciously saying, I'm going to get back at my parents because of the way they treat me, but that's essentially what's happening, is that it's passive on the outside, but aggressive on the inside that shows up in their behavior. And that's why it's so important that parents learn how to help children walk through their anger, not just simply tell them to shut up and go to their room.
Well, and again, in your chapter on children handling anger, it seems to me that you need to focus on meeting the child's need for emotional love, because sometimes we're real good on the rules, but not the relationship. And, of course, you've heard that. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. So it seems to me that the man that has taught us so much over the years about the 5 love languages needs to remind us that love is very key to begin to help your child begin to address and handle their anger.
And I think Kerby, that when we wrap our discipline in love, for example, let's say that the child has thrown the ball in the house instead of out in the yard, and that's against the rules. We're getting ready now to administer discipline. We've already told the child that if you do that, the ball goes in the trunk of the car for 2 days. And so if words is their language, love language, you say, Johnny, I love you so much, and I'm really proud of you, because normally you keep the rules. But, you broke the rule today. You threw the ball in the house. So you know what happens to the ball, right? I have to put it in the car. But listen, I love you so much, and I'm so proud of you, because normally you don't break the rules. And Johnny walks away feeling he was treated fairly, and he's far less likely to ever throw the ball again. But if you simply just grab the ball and say, I told you not to do this, give me that ball, it's going in the trunk of the car, Johnny walks away thinking, I try hard to do what's right, and I mess up one time, and my mother gets angry with me or my father gets angry with me. So if we wrap our discipline in love, the child's far more likely to receive the discipline in a positive way and change their behavior.
And again, if you don't want to say that to a 5-year-old, you certainly don't want to say that to a 15-year-old. And that's something I've picked up from a number of counselors, including one that we just talked with recently. The tendency to sometimes not have an age-appropriate response to some kind of disciplinary issue, and find yourself sometimes talking to your teenagers like you talk to a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old. That's really going to lead to all sorts of rebellion, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I remember the 13-year-old who sat in my office and said, my father yells and screams at me, telling me to stop yelling and screaming at him. When parents complain to me about their teenagers yelling and screaming at them, I normally ask, where do you think they learned that?
Yes. Yeah, and I think we know the answer to that one, don't we?
I have to do what I did. I had to say to my teenage son at one juncture, Derek, I'm not handling my anger very well, and you're not handling yours well, and I can't expect you to do something I'm not doing. So why don't we learn how to do this better? The next time you get angry with me, how about just coming and saying, Dad, I'm angry, can we talk? And let's sit down and see if we can talk rather than yelling at each other. And I'll do the same thing with you. I'll just say, Derek, I'm angry, can we talk? And that was really a huge turning point in us when I was willing to admit to my son that I wasn't handling my anger very well.
Very good. Again, we've talked about kids. Let's go back to one of the chapters on a spouse, and I have a caller here that would like to address that. We'll go to Missouri this time and talk to Jerry. You're on with Dr. Gary Chapman.
Yes, I have a severe marital situation. I feel it's gotten severe. It's a second marriage for me, third for my husband. And he goes into violent rages, and it's really escalating, and there's name-calling to me and put-downs, and it all stems from his refusal to put behind him any thoughts of my ex-spouse, which I was single for 15 years. And didn't date or anything because I was so afraid to make a mistake. And, and so he has built in his mind that this man is a threat to him or something, and accuses me if I want to go to a grandchild's birthday party or anything. He's made it so uncomfortable for everybody. But see, to himself, that's me lying, saying that they're uncomfortable or that he's done this because he thinks he's got people fooled. And he rants at me to the point of crushing me, and then I have to go into situations or visit my children, and I'm such a rattled mess, and of course they can catch on, and it's getting worse.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about boundaries here, and we're talking about maybe also your chapter on confronting an angry person. What thoughts would you have, Dr. Chapman?
Yeah, I think first of all we have to acknowledge that kind of behavior on the part of a husband is not appropriate behavior and cannot be accepted. So I think you say to him something like this, I don't know whether you feel my love or not. If you don't, I'm happy to talk about it, and you can talk about the love languages. Are you speaking his love language? Does he really feel your love? And if not, you address that issue because you want him to feel love. If he feels loved, he's less likely to be suspecting things of you. So I would take that approach first of all and tell him, you want him to know you love him. Maybe you're not doing a good job at that. But then having done that, and if you are speaking his love language on a regular basis, you're saying to him, I don't know how you feel. I really love you. I think I speak your love language, but the way you treat me is just not appropriate. And I don't know if you're willing to go for counseling with me, but if you're not, I'm going for counseling myself because I've got to have some help here. And you take that kind of step because the very next thing you need to do is show tough love to him. But you need to have a pastor or a counselor or somebody with you. I don't mean physically with you, but I mean walking with you through this process before you administer tough love to him. Because some people only respond to tough love, which says, I love you too much to sit here and do nothing. And if you're not willing to get help with this, then I'm going to move in with my mother, or I'm going to do whatever it is you're going to do. You take a strong step which says to them, I'm not abandoning you. I love you, but I'm not going to sit here and do nothing while you destroy yourself and destroy me.
Very well said. Let's take a break. When we come back, also that gets us into a conversation that you have in the book about forgiveness and dealing with that and how to sometimes deal with long-term anger, as well as a number of other issues and resentment. So we'll get into those quickly. And, of course, if you want to understand this entire topic, I would certainly commend this book to you, over 200 pages, published by Moody Publishing. It's available in your local bookstore, but we also have information on our website. Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. Dr. Gary Chapman, he'll be back with us after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Gary Chapman with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. And Dr. Chapman, let's, if we can, talk about long-term anger. There are individuals listening to us that have been angry for some time about a hurt in their past that they are holding on to and are dealing with anger, maybe resentment. Maybe they're even dealing with depression because they've been holding on to it for so long. What would you say to those individuals?
Well, I think often this happens, and it's normally not just one offense. It's a whole series of offenses, maybe stemming even back to childhood. It may have been a mother or a father, a sibling, and other people along the way who have wronged this person. And the person either didn't know how to process the anger or they tried and they were rebuffed. A parent told them to shut up and whatever. And so they've held all this anger inside, and now they're adults. And one or two things can happen. They either move toward depression, the whole world is against me, there's no hope, I've been wronged all my life, or they explode. These are the kind of people who explode and sometimes do very, very rash things. And that long-term anger can be identified if you overreact to little things in life. If you're the kind of person, for example, you're sitting at a traffic light, the light turns green, and the little lady in front of you doesn't move, and you blow the horn at her, there's a good chance you've got stored anger inside.
For sure.
You overreact to little things. So I think those people, I really deal with this rather thoroughly in the book, because I think these folks really need help. And most of them, many of them are not aware that they even have a problem. They've lived with this so long. But I talk about how to go back and let God identify and bring back to your mind the people that wronged you and how they wronged you, and then release those people and release the anger to God. Turn it over to Him. He's the righteous judge, and just put them in His hands and let Him take care of them. And then you say, now teach me in the future how to handle my anger in a positive way. So it's getting rid of all that past emotion inside of us that really frees us up to become a new person.
I would say so, and that kind of leads us into forgiveness. Of course, you talk about how God forgives us and this issue of reconciliation and repentance, and there's a number of things that are involved in that forgiveness stage, is there not?
Well, there is. I think, first of all, there's an apology. Sometimes there's a confrontation before there's an apology. As Jesus said in Luke 17, your brother offends you, then you go to them, you confront them, and if they repent, He said you forgive them. Matthew 18, He says if they don't repent the first time, you go back a second time and take somebody with you and try again. And then the third time, you tell the church and assume that they send somebody with you. If 3 times and they're not willing to deal with their failure, He didn't say forgive them. He said treat them as a pagan. What do you do with pagans? You pray for them. You do kind things to them. You return good for evil. Again, you're trying to be God's agent to touch their hearts. But forgiveness in the Bible is always a response to a sincere apology. And we, as Christians, we must always be ready to forgive, because God always forgives us when we come to Him with confession. David said, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. And we must be open. When people apologize to us, we must be open to forgive, no matter what they've done.
You talk about in the book that unresolved anger is very important to address, because it's something that can tear apart a marriage, really tear apart a family. So this is, I know, one of the reasons you wrote this book, because this unresolved anger, maybe even not being aware of the anger, and yet acting out and being so difficult around other family members as something that really can create a tremendous amount of strife in a relationship. And that's why we need to actually figure out how to tame this powerful emotion of anger.
It is, and I think, rather than putting ourselves down for feeling angry, we need to analyze our anger and say, where is it coming from? Did somebody sin against me? If they did, then I need to go confront them. But if it's simply that I'm not getting my way in these things, then I need to acknowledge that as self-centeredness, and I need to say to God, forgive me for being so immature here. So I think either way, whether it's definitive anger, you've been wronged, or whether it's distorted anger, you simply didn't get your way, we must process that anger. Otherwise, you hold the anger inside, it turns to bitterness, it turns to hatred, and both of those are condemned in Scripture. God never intended us to get that far down the road. We've got to process our anger so that we don't live with anger inside of us.
And even spiritual implications as well, because you have a chapter on when you're angry at God. I mean, it can really hurt your spiritual walk. It can hurt your relationship with God if you don't at least acknowledge that you're angry with God because some horrible thing might have happened in your life.
I think so. And, often with Christians, we pray for something that's really important to us, and maybe it's a sick family member, and then they die. And we feel like God didn't treat us fairly. See, again, the anger is a response to feeling we weren't treated fairly. And yes, we can get angry with God. Jonah got angry with God because God forgave the people in Nineveh. And he said, you made me look like a fool. I told them you're going to destroy this place. So we have a number of examples where people got angry with God. And I say, if you feel that way toward God, just tell God. You're not going to hurt God's feelings. He already knows what's going on in your heart anyway. Just tell God how you feel. And then having told God, listen to the still small voice of God. And you will likely hear him say, I understand, my son. You don't get it. You're going to have to trust me here. My ways are higher than your ways. So stick with me. I want to stick with you. And then we, with our pain, we walk with God through the process.
We're talking today with Dr. Gary Chapman. Let me just also encourage you to visit his website, 5lovelanguages.com, the number 5lovelanguages.com. Of course, we have a link to it on our website. You can find out more, not only about this book, but many of his other books, and there are ways in which you can follow his organization and benefit from some of the material that is available. We've posted one of the videos there for you to watch, so let me encourage you to watch that video. It's a little less than 2 minutes long, won't take you long. Then you can pass it on to others and maybe let them know a little bit more about the existence of this book, and maybe send them on a way in which they can apply and begin to process their anger from a biblical point of view and thus bring glory to God. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, always great to have you on the program with us here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I always enjoy being with you. You keep up the good work.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, Dr. Gary Chapman, you are, of course, most familiar with him and his 5 Love Language series, and there are a series of books in that regard. And this one, a little bit different, but it relates to so many of the conversations that we've had on this issue of marriage and family, Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. And it is published by Moody Publishers, and it deals with such things as anger that might be from a biblical point of view and might be justifiable when you're angry for a good reason, what to do when your anger is wrong and how to handle that bad anger. What about explosions and implosions? And we just talked a few minutes ago about anger that lasts for years and the issue of forgiveness, and then has some very good, very practical chapters on when you're angry at your spouse, helping children handle anger, when you're angry at God, and even I'm angry at myself. And then finally, a chapter on confronting an angry person. Lots of great practical material, very biblically oriented, and I would certainly encourage you to find out a little bit more about him. And so you can do so by going to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll also see that we have our viewpoint section, our take action section, and of course information about the guests that we've covered here today. So we encourage you to go to pointofview.net. If you say, I'd like to hear this again, you covered some points, but I didn't have a chance to write them all down, you can download the podcast and listen to it, or you can watch the livecast at our YouTube channel on YouTube. And so they're just some great resources that we always try to make available to you so that you can benefit from those. And of course, we also encourage you to support us. You can click on that button that's available there, and we would greatly appreciate your financial support. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation today here on Point of View. But don't forget, this is a time during the break when you can join with us. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever listened to Point of View for a very length of time, you know that sometimes we talk about the importance of looking at our history, especially America's godly heritage. And this hour, that's exactly what we're going to do. Focus on what you might refer to as the Black Robed Regiment. You might say, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, this was a term that was actually coined by a British loyalist by the name of Peter Oliver, and it was an attempt to say that the pastors and preachers of the 18th century who wore black robes, in some respects, were very responsible for the American Revolution. And this is the term that the British referred to them as the Black Robe Regiment. The preaching and the teaching in the pulpits in the 18th century led in part to the American Revolution. And so we're going to spend some time today focusing on that. Let me just initially say that we're going to be using a lot of great material from a book by Dan Fisher called Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment, a call for preachers who will fight. And this is a resource that we have posted on our website. So if you'd like to get the book, it's about 400 pages. We're not going to cover all of it, not even close. That is available. There's also a DVD that goes with it as well. But we've also, in addition to that, given you an opportunity to see some of the slides that I've used in a presentation based upon this book and some of the other study that I've done as well. And that PDF is available at pointofview.net. So you can go there right now if you'd like and follow along as I'm teaching. Occasionally I'll refer to something in one of the diagrams, and it certainly is easier to follow if you happen to be following it. Or if you'd like to look at it later, it's available to you. But again, this is material put together by Dan Fisher. He's a pastor, former member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. And again, it's all about these patriot preachers, individuals who actually were very instrumental, as we're going to see over this next hour, in terms of really motivating individuals to consider liberty and to look at the possibility that they might separate from England and really declare their independence. And so, again, this is a resource that I think will be very helpful to you. And at the outset, let me mention, I'm going to only focus on a few of the key figures, and I'm not even suggesting that all the pastors and preachers actually supported the revolution. I mean, you have probably the most outstanding Tory who disagreed with that would be John Wesley. He was, of course, British, but nevertheless, there were some pastors and preachers who did not support the American Revolution, but we're going to look on those that did. Now, in terms of some of the biblical passages, a couple that I've put on the screen, one comes from Proverbs 14, verse 34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And, of course, that goes along with, of course, Psalm 33:12, which talks about the fact that, indeed, this is a nation whose God is the Lord. So we certainly recognize how important righteousness is. But a contrary verse you can find in Psalm 91:7, and that is, the wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. And so one of the emphasis, I think, that, and really the application point is that we certainly, as believers, I think, should very much support the fact that we believe in religious liberty, something we talk about so often here on Point of View, and we should certainly be people of prayer and people of righteousness if indeed we want God's blessing on this country. Let me, if I can, just before we get into the specific stories of some of these individuals, give you a little bit of the history. And this is part of the history that has been lost. I dare say that your children or grandchildren, if they've been in the public schools in the last couple of years, have not heard a word about this. I would suggest to you that maybe even if you're much older, you probably haven't heard much about this, because unless you went maybe to a Christian school where the teacher was really interested in this, almost everything you're going to hear over this hour is probably new. That wasn't always the case. If you go back to the 19th century, there were a number of historians who I'm going to quote along the way that talk about this, and one of those is Frank Moore. Wrote a book in 1862, right during the Civil War, interestingly enough, The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution. And he said that the preachers of the Revolution did not hesitate to attack the great political and social evils of their day. Now, that was true in the First Great Awakening. It was true during the American Revolution, and it was certainly true during the Second Great Awakening as well. And we've talked about some of that here on Point of View. Another book that came out also during that same period of time came out in 1860, The Pulpit of the American Revolution by John Wingate Thornton. And he says, the fathers of the Republic invoked God in their civil assemblies, called upon their chosen teachers of religion to counsel from the Bible, and recognized its precepts as the law of their public conduct. The fathers did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly, which I think is so interesting, because this idea today that we should separate politics and religion. Some of you may have grown up in homes where were told not to talk about politics and religion in mixed society, and certainly we should never talk about politics in church. That was not the idea of those who were the center of the intellectual life of the American colonies. After all, the churches really were kind of the center of the intellectual life and the center of culture at that time, and they certainly did not want to divorce politics and religion. John Wingate Thornton goes on to say they prepared for the struggle and went into the battle, not as soldiers of fortune, but with the word of God in their hearts and trusting in him. That was the secret of their moral energy, which sustained the republics in its material weakness against superior numbers and discipline and all the power of England. England sent her armies to compel submission, and the colonists appealed to heaven. So we're going to spend some time in the next few minutes talking about a number of key figures. Probably one that we've mentioned a little bit on this program before is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. And I'll also even talk a little bit about the correspondence between Peter Muhlenberg and his brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who later changed his mind. Then we're going to talk about people like Jonas Clark and what happened in Lexington and Concord. We'll talk about James Caldwell, who was actually a Presbyterian in New Jersey. And then we'll get into just a few of the other key figures that were very instrumental in the founding of this country and the framing of the Constitution, and even of the thinking through and evaluating from a biblical point of view things like civil disobedience. Jonathan Mayhew, very famous essay and sermon on the idea of non-resistance and civil disobedience and how that came to be. And John Witherspoon, who was an individual that was the president of what today is Princeton University, taught James Madison, many members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and others. And before we're through, since again the title of this book is Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment, what about the responsibility that pastors and even we church members have in terms of articulating a biblical worldview? But we need to take a break, and let me just mention again, if you're just joining us, that we're working our way through the book by Dan Fisher called Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment. There's also a DVD that goes with it, and if you'd like to follow along, we've posted my PDF file so that you can put that on your computer, your smartphone, and see some of the diagrams, some of the pictures that I'll be referring to, and it's all available to you at our website, pointofview.net. And I hope that at the end you say, I might like to listen to that again. You have an opportunity to either watch it or, more importantly, just simply listen to it as a podcast, and even send it on to some others that you think might want to hear that as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about some of those patriot preachers in the 18th century. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the World Health Organization has just added an unusual disorder to its list of mental health conditions. People who play an excessive amount of video games could be diagnosed with a gaming disorder. Of course, they aren't saying that anyone who lives to play video games has this mental disorder, but they do set out some criteria to identify people with a gaming disorder. First, they show impaired control over gaming. This includes such things as frequency, intensity, and duration. Second, a person with this disorder shows an increasing priority to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. Third, there usually is a continuation or even an escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. You know, video gaming is no longer just for the young. It has become increasingly popular with people of all ages. The Entertainment Software Association estimates that more than 150 million Americans play video games. So it's not surprising that psychologists have been able to document video game addiction. It turns out that the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders defined Internet gaming disorder as a condition for further study. It also said the disorder was most common among male adolescents, but we're seeing problems surfacing in every age group. Video games can be a safe way of improving hand-eye coordination, enhancing problem-solving abilities, and relieving stress. But the concerns about addiction and gaming disorder should concern youth and adults. Video games can be addicting and apparently take over the lives of many who find them too enticing to moderate. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Topic today is the idea of the Black Robed Regiment, which again refers to those 18th century pastors and preachers who were so instrumental in beginning to educate and encouraging individuals in the American colonies to actually participate in the American Revolution. One of the key figures is a man by the name of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. We'll just refer to him as Peter Muhlenberg. He was a Lutheran pastor, but in addition to being the pastor, also served in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, Virginia. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, Virginia, you actually go into the House of Burgesses, and he served in there with people like George Washington and a number of other individuals as well. Patrick Henry, probably one of the more fiery individuals who earlier that year had actually called for them to stand up and either said, "Give me liberty or give me death," and even had this idea of plunging a knife into his heart, and it caught everybody's attention. Well, eventually it began to be obvious to him that he was going to have to serve and wanted to serve in the military. And so he left from Williamsburg, which is sort of in the southeastern corner of Virginia, back to his pulpit, which is in Woodstock, Virginia, which is kind of in the northwest corner, and had announced that on January 21st, 1776, he was going to preach his last sermon. And he chose to preach on the book of Ecclesiastes, and in particular, Ecclesiastes 3. And especially there was a very significant time in Ecclesiastes 3:8. Now, we have a record of this, which appears in the book by Dan Fisher, The Black Robed Regiment, which was written by his nephew, Henry Augustus Muhlenberg, many years later. And he said on his arrival at Woodstock, his different congregations widely scattered along the frontier were notified that upon the following Sabbath, their beloved pastor would deliver his farewell sermon. The appointed day came. The rude country church was filled to overflowing with the hardy mountaineers of their frontier counties, among whom were collected one or more of the independent companies to which the forethought of the convention had given birth. And it goes in to talk about some of the details. In the interest of time, I'll skip down to, though, when he is now preaching on Ecclesiastes 3, in which he says that in the language of Holy Writ there was a time for all things, a time to preach and a time to pray. But those times had passed, and in a voice that re-echoed through the church like a trumpet blast, that there was a time to fight, and that time has now come. When he finished the sermon, there was sort of a stillness that they talk about here, and he then takes off his robe, and in the particular PDF that we have available to you is a picture that a painting that was drawn in which he's taking off his black robe, and underneath his robe is the actual uniform of an officer in the Continental Army. And so it has become now obvious that he is going to leave the pulpit, he's going to leave the pastorate, and he is going to now serve as he does with George Washington. He goes to the back of the room, and here again, reading from the account by his nephew, nearly 300 men of the frontier churches that day enlisted under his banner, and then, of course, went on to serve with him. If you're not familiar with John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, he ends up in almost all the very significant battles with George Washington, all the way to the end in Yorktown. Later, of course, he came back to not only be a pastor, but also a member of Congress in Pennsylvania. And one of the pictures I have here shows a statue. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., there's a statuary hall, and you will see his statue that is there depicting him from Pennsylvania. And on his left side, you will see a sword and see that he is in the uniform of a Continental soldier. But on the right hand, you will see, draped over his arm is his robe as a Lutheran pastor. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you go and spend a little bit of time looking at the story of John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, you also know that not only did he serve in Congress, but his brother Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg served in Congress, but not initially. Frederick Muhlenberg, a Lutheran pastor, in this case was in New York, actually expressed to his other brother that he thought Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg was kind of losing his mind. And so as a result, we do have the correspondence of Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg writing to Frederick Muhlenberg, in which he said, "I'm a clergyman, it is true, but I'm also a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as any man. Shall I then sit still and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the continent is spilling? Heaven forbid it." And he goes on to say, "Do you think then if America should be conquered, I should be safe? Nothing less. Would you not sooner fight like a man than die the death of a dog?" Well, after he received that letter, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg's church actually was taken over by the British, and it was burned down. Matter of fact, the British lots of times would burn down the churches because they felt that some of these pastors were causing all of the problems. Others would use the churches as a stable and put horses in there and kind of desecrate the church. And Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg eventually, actually pretty quickly changed his mind, as far as we can tell from his correspondence. Later, not only served in Congress, but also was the first Speaker of the House in Congress. And if you ever go to Washington, D.C., you can, of course, see their statutes. But if you go to the National Archives, you'll see the Declaration of Independence. You'll see the Constitution. And you'll also see the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, you'll see that it's signed by only two people: John Adams, at that time the President of the United States, and Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And I think, again, the idea that maybe politics and religion don't mix, well, these Muhlenberg brothers kind of changed their minds. Let's get to the story of Paul Revere. Again, a very significant date indeed in history, April 18th, 1775. And a lot of people know that he was riding through the countryside saying, "The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming." Where was he headed? Well, that's where I want to tell the story of the pastor, Jonas Clark, because they were headed to Jonas Clark and his home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Why so? Well, in his home that night were Samuel Adams and John Hancock. One of the things was to alert them, because if the British had captured them, they might have publicly executed them, or at the very least might have held them as prisoners and exchanged them for other prisoners. And so this was dangerous to them. But more importantly, both Samuel Adams and John Hancock turned to Jonas Clark and said, if the British are coming and the regulars are coming, you've been training men in your church. Are they ready? Interesting enough, Jonas Clark said, I trained them for this very hour. They would fight and if need be die under the shadow of the house of God. That's because not only did he train them, but the person that probably did the most training was a man by the name of John Parker. He's known as Captain John Parker, but John Parker was a deacon in that church. You have the pastor of that church and the deacon of that church essentially training these individuals. And so when the British eventually made their way to the Lexington Commons, they were met by the Minutemen. Who are the Minutemen? Those are the people trained by Captain John Parker, deacon of that church. And if you ever go to Lexington, you will see a stone there, and on the stone it says what John Parker said to those men standing there: stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here. Well, the British commander was going to have none of it, so he rides up and tells them to throw down their arms in the name of the King of England. Captain Parker and his men responded, we recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. But eventually there was a standoff, and so that's where Captain Parker at that point says, okay, I think we've made our point, so let's leave. And so they turned to leave, but someone fired a flintlock, and that became the shot heard round the world, because then the British opened fire, the militia and the Minutemen returned fire, and before the dust and the smoke had cleared, 8 Americans were dead on the ground and 10 more were wounded. And just as had been predicted, interestingly enough, by Jonas Clark, some of those men indeed died under the shadow of the house of God. Well, then they went on to Concord, and they ran into more of the militia and a battle that took place there. And eventually the British, not being able to find the weapons, because this was kind of gun control of the 18th century, went back to Boston. But as they did, the militia continued to fire on them. And one of the things I have in the PDF file that we're making available is a copy of the sermon that was given a year later on April 19th, 1776 by Pastor Jonas Clark. The sermon was entitled, The Fate of the Bloodthirsty Oppressors and God's Tender Care of His Distressed People. And it's a quote from a number of verses, but one in Proverbs about those who shed innocent blood. So you can see that even one of the more significant conflicts, the shot heard around the world, really is tied back to the pastor, Jonas Clark, and the deacon, whose name, interestingly enough, was Clark himself, Parker, John Parker. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our teaching this hour on the Black Robed Regiment. And if you'd like to follow along, Ken, we have a PDF file that is available on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, a lot of this comes from the book by Dan Fisher, which I would certainly recommend, Bringing Back the Black Robed Regiment. There's also a DVD that goes with it as well. We've talked about Lutherans, talked about Church of Christ. Let's if we can, maybe focus on the Presbyterians for just a minute. Probably the best example would be Reverend James Caldwell, who was pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. He was known as the high priest of the rebellion by the British, and perhaps was one of the most controversial figures for the British because he was always seemingly going out of his way to say something provocative and controversial, and eventually there was a price put on his head. Well, the sad reality is that, first of all, when he was indeed involved in another activity, his wife was killed. And in this book, again, it talks about the fact that when the individual that many people assume was British, since he was wearing a red coat, could have been someone else, came to the window of Reverend James Caldwell's home, and at the time he was away with the army in a place called Short Hills, this individual came, brought his musket up to his shoulders, and shot twice through the window and killed Hannah Caldwell. She had just nursed her child. Matter of fact, the glass hit the child. She falls over with 2 musket balls in her breasts, dead on the bed. James Caldwell is in a distance, and he's actually standing next to General Lafayette, and he looks through an eyeglass towards the Connecticut farms over where he was. Seeing the smoke of burning buildings, said, "Thank God the fire is not in the direction of my home." Unfortunately, he was mistaken. The family and the neighbors drug her out of the house because the British set fire to his home. So when he got back, he found out that she had been killed. So under a white flag comes into there, is able to reclaim his wife's body and actually did a funeral for her. So first of all, he is now without a wife. His children then are put in the care of some of the members of the congregation, the neighbors and family. And so now let's fast forward to a battle that he was participating in when the men were fighting the British at Springfield, New Jersey. And as he rides up, he hears them say, "We are out of wadding for the muskets." Now, if you're not familiar with the muskets, you have to pour some powder into a pan. Matter of fact, if it burns and doesn't fire the ball, it's called a flash in the pan. You ever heard the phrase flash in the pan? Well, that's because there's a lot of flash but no impact. But the wadding is necessary in order for the musket ball to actually be pushed down into the chamber, so when the explosion takes place, it will actually go a distance, and they no longer had the wadding necessary. So Pastor James Caldwell rides to the Springfield Presbyterian Church, bundles up, and we have pictures of this in a famous painting, some of the hymnals, and begins to throw the hymnals to the men and tells them to tear out the pages of the hymnals. Many of the hymns at that time were written by Isaac Watts. And so as he's throwing the hymnals, he says, "Give them Watts, pour Watts into them." Matter of fact, have you ever heard the phrase, "Give them what for?" Well, that's where that phrase comes from, "Give them Watts for." And so he actually was using the hymnals to create wadding so that they could fire against the British. And so, again, James Caldwell was the hero in that day, using the hymnals from Springfield Presbyterian Church to aid those individuals that were fighting against the British. The sad reality is later on he was assassinated by a paid assassin, and it's just an illustration again of the fact that we have these individuals who, when they signed the Declaration, said, "We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Many of them lost their lives. Most of them lost their fortunes, but none of them gave up their honor. And again, just an incredible story there as well. And while I'm talking about the Presbyterians, I have some material in there about how the Presbyterians were seen to be the reason for the American Revolution. King George II called the American Revolution a Presbyterian Revolution. The Prime Minister's son at that time, Horace Walpole, said, "There's no use in crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson." And a colonial supporter of the king actually wrote in one letter, "I fix all the blame for these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. They have been the chief and principal instrument in all of these flaming measures." George Bancroft, who is a historian, and I've had a chance to look at some of his historical books in the Dallas Public Library, said the revolution of 1776, so far it was affected by religion, was a Presbyterian measure. And of course, earlier we mentioned that Peter Oliver actually is the first one to give credit for using the title, the Black Robed Regiment. So as we're winding down in this hour, I wanted to at least focus on a few key figures in the American Revolution. I could talk about a lot more of the pastors, but let me move from a pastor to a man by the name of John Adams. Well, who was John Adams? Well, John Adams, first of all, was one of those individuals put on a committee to actually draft the Declaration of Independence. That committee included such people as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and others. And John Adams then later served as the first vice president of the United States under General George Washington, later served as the second president of the United States, and later his son served as a president of the United States as well. Well, in 1818, he wrote an essay called The Meaning of the American Revolution because he wanted people to understand what were the ideas that led to the American Revolution. And he said the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the mind and hearts of the people and a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. And he lists a number of men that were responsible for the revival of the American principles that led to the American Revolution. Talks about John Locke and the writings of him. But two people that he mentioned that are mentioned fairly prominently are Dr. Samuel Cooper and Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. And unless you are a real student of American history, you've got to say, who are these individuals? Well, it turns out that Dr. Samuel Cooper was the pastor of Brattle Street Church. Two very prominent members of his church were John Hancock, and Samuel Adams was a friend, and also John Adams. So you had John Hancock and John Adams, who were members of the church, and, of course, close friends with Samuel Adams, who is oftentimes seen as one of the key figures in the American Revolution, and he also corresponded regularly with Benjamin Franklin. The other is Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, who has oftentimes been referred to as the father of civil and religious liberty in Massachusetts and America. He oftentimes gave what were called election sermons, and those are still traditions that sometimes are held to this day, that on election day or the Sunday before, they'll give a sermon, not to tell you who to vote for, but giving you biblical principles to use when you go and vote. And in 1750 and 1754, those election sermons were very significant. And as a matter of fact, in one of those sermons in 1750, he came up with a phrase that we've heard to this very day: no taxation without representation. Where did that idea come from? Well, it came from one of the pulpits in the 18th century. He opposed the Stamp Act and urged the necessity of actually securing liberty and this idea of no taxation without representation. Some of his members of his congregation eventually dressed up as Indians, went on a ship, and took the tea and threw it into the harbor, known as, of course, the Boston Tea Party. But his most famous sermon, which we have because they would write out their sermons, reprint them, and distribute them, was a sermon that actually took place many years before the American Revolution, and it was a sermon called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. It was a sermon, quite frankly, that helped many of the Christians think about, is there ever a time when we could disobey government? After all, disobeying the crown could be considered treason. Is that even possible? And he takes them through. You know, Moses is a good example of civil disobedience. He was alive only because of the Hebrew midwives disobeying the government. 3 different times in the book of Daniel, we have civil disobedience. Even in the New Testament, we have Acts 5:29. We will obey God rather than men. And so he said it was a Christian duty not only to begin to obey government, but in those cases where government has exceeded its authority, when government has become tyrannical, when we have unjust rulers, it's not only the right, but it's the duty of a Christian to oppose unjust leaders. Well, when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one other very key individual. His name was John Witherspoon, and then talk about what's the possible application of all of this to our day as well. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to listen to this again, of course, the podcast is available. If you'd like to find the PDF, it's available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation about the Black Robed Regiment right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Come back for a few more minutes as we conclude our conversation today about the Black Robed Regiment. Let me just mention that the book by Dan Fisher is 400 pages. No way we could possibly cover all of that in an hour, but I wanted to give you a few highlights. And if nothing else, come down to the last couple of moments to, again, maybe focus on one or two other individuals and maybe an application. One of those individuals is a man by the name of John Witherspoon. Now, he is significant in a number of ways. Not only was he a minister, but he was also the president of what today we would call Princeton. Back then it was College of New Jersey, but again, that what eventually became Princeton University. But he also was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. For people that say, well, I think pastors should stay out of politics, here is a pastor who actually was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But more importantly, as I've talked about on this program before, his profound influence as a teacher is immense. First of all, the most significant person who studied under him is a man by the name of James Madison. James Madison, of course, is known as the architect of the Constitution. Very significant in terms of his involvement in the writing, the drafting of the Constitution. Later, of course, served as a president as well. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. But he also taught 77 other members of Congress. He taught 3 Supreme Court justices. But if you will, his political pilgrimage is significant, because even up to, I think, the early part of 1776, he wasn't quite sure that we should be engaged in separating from England. This was, of course, a very dramatic action. To actually leave and have the colonies separate from England was a treasonous act. And so it was something that individuals had to think through. And I just mentioned a minute ago Jonathan Mayhew's influence in that regard. But eventually he did conclude that this was something that should be done, and preached perhaps one of the more famous sermons during 1776 called The Dominion of Providence over the Affairs of Men, and actually preached that on May 17th, 1776. Of course, when you talk about July 4th, 1776, of course, that is the commemoration of the Declaration of Independence. And so this was something that he concluded must be done and should be done. And it's interesting because one time a member said, I don't think we're ripe for revolution. Well, Witherspoon replied, "Not ripe, sir. In my judgments, we're not only ripe, but unless some action is taken, we will be rotting." So again, I think what you can see as we've gone through some of this is to recognize that we really are talking about the fact that pastors in the 18th century were very influential. In other presentations I've given, I've pointed out that some of the sermons that were given by the pastors of the 18th century were later actually cited and quoted from in the writings of the founders. So many of the ideas that were preached from the pulpits of the 18th century eventually found their way into the debate and the discussion that gave us the Constitution. So these pastors were very bold. Now, one of the reasons Dan Fisher put his book together as well as his DVD was because he's convinced, as we are, that pastors need to address these issues. Now, let's be honest and say that many pastors do indeed do that. Matter of fact, many of them have been on this program, so let's give credit where credit is due. Many pastors do address these issues from the pulpit from time to time, but most do not, and that needs to change. So if there's an application point, we are calling for pastors to be bold, just as their predecessors in the 18th century were. But what about you? You may not be a pastor. What can you do? Well, I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, that's just a national issue. Maybe I can support some of these groups that are religious liberty groups. Maybe I can support pastors. Maybe I can make sure I at least vote for the right people in elections. And all of that is indeed true. But let me use one illustration that Kelly Shackelford has used before. Even in your local community, there's something you can do. Kelly Shackelford's been on our program many times before at First Liberty and heard about this actual senior center down the road, not far from where we're broadcasting, where the seniors in that senior center were told, you cannot pray, you cannot have a Bible study, you cannot have worship songs. Why? Because government funds are actually going to the senior center and you cannot do that. And this was the stand of these 4 individuals who were on the city council. Well, Kelly sent one of his associates to go down and check it out and came back and said, I don't want to educate them. I want to destroy them. And Kelly said, no, we don't want to do that. But he said, let's send out a letter of demand and explain why this is not an unconstitutional establishment of religion. There was no movement. So finally they decided to file a lawsuit and they had a press conference. And if you've ever seen the press conference, Kelly's speaking, and at the end, he does something I wouldn't recommend you do, because behind him are all the various seniors from the senior center, and he says, did anybody have anything to say? Well, Barney, at the end there, he's got a cowboy hat on, he's got a bolo tie, he's got boots. He comes up and he says, I fought in World War II, and I didn't fight so that I had to pray in the corner. So if they want to arrest me, they can arrest me, but they have to put on the arrest warrant that I was arrested for praying. Well, that kind of got everybody's attention. The media blew up. A couple hours later, Kelly got a call from Bill O'Reilly saying, we want to put you on our program and bring the guy in the cowboy hat. Well, eventually, of course, what happened is that they were able to be successful and say that indeed they could have religious studies and all sorts of events at the senior center. But then the people in the community said, you know, these 4 city council people, they just are not exactly the people we're real thrilled about. So they held a recall election and removed them from office. And I heard more recently that Kelly said that one of those seniors sitting behind him, standing behind him, actually is on the city council now. So I think there is a need for us to encourage pastors to speak to the issues of the day. We need to know how to articulate a biblical point of view. We need to know how to defend a biblical point of view, and that's what Point of View is all about. And so we really want to be a resource for you. But also, as you go to the website, you'll see some of the information about the book, and you can also get the DVD, and maybe even if you'd like to listen to this again, the podcast is available. So certainly we need to encourage pastors to take a stand for truth. But you know what? I think it's also important for us to take a stand for truth as well. And not just to be aware of how a particular candidate stands on the issues, as important as that is, and we'll continue to provide all sorts of resources for you so that you know where individuals stand on those issues, but also how important it is for you to stand up for the issues and recognize that God may be calling you to get involved. And it may not be to run for Congress, may not be to run for the city council or the school board. It might be just for you to work in a particular campaign or to express your opinion or to learn a little bit more about what's going on in your community and to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But if nothing else, I hope that this hour really gave you a desire to learn a little bit more about our history. And as you learn our history, you can recognize that there were courageous individuals in the past who were willing to stand on God's word and willing to stand on truth to make a difference in their community. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, as always, we encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, first of all, of course, you can go back and download the podcast and listen to this again, or you can send it to someone else. Of course, there's a share button there as well. You can watch the program again. And, of course, the PDF is available to you. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let me also say that we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. And so as we wind down the program today, I just wanted to encourage you to visit the website, but also click on that button that says donate. Your financial gifts are helpful to us, and we certainly do need to hear from you. So anything you can do to help us would be greatly appreciated. I want to thank Andrew and Stephen for the help behind the scenes. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.